The third and last flare, Satania, caused the split into those animals that were able to pull energy from the atmosphere.
Many more eons went by before the flights to planet Earth began from the Andromeda galaxy. The ball of fire, which was our planet Earth, blazing in the distance, was visible at all times for hundreds of thousands of years until gradually it began to cool. Space expeditions went every 1,000 years or so. Remember, time is irrelevant everywhere else in space. These exploring ships would bring back samples of life forms that were developing and continuously monitor the direction they were evolving in. They were put in laboratories and their evolution speeded up so that the explorers knew, eons before it happened, what man would eventually look like. The speed up of evolution was done by artificially inseminating evolving man with their own genes. This is where the saying that we were made in God's image came from. The saying that God made heaven and earth in 6 days, rested on the seventh, and God said, "Let there be light," so on, came about by the spacemen describing what they saw when they made their trips every 1,000 years or so. The first day, biblically speaking, was the first trip, the second day the second trip, and so on. The first day mentioned in the Bible referred to the first ships from other galaxies, of which the Andromedans made the first 2 trips. The first trip was the discovery of the amoeba, and on the second trip they discovered that it had progressed into the upright animal form. These would be the first 2 days, biblically speaking. The travelers from the Andromeda galaxy watched the cooling down process. Their spaceships traveled to it before it even cooled enough for landing. It had cooled to a solid, but the gases were still curling up off of it, and lava would bubble up everywhere. They stayed with it until the discovery of the amoeba. The next flare was called Satania, the third pass or trip through the oversoul. To review, Demonia gave us the word demon. This first flare was of a positive nature, male energy. Harmonia gave us the word harmony. The second flare was negative, female energy. Satania gave us the word Satan, and this third flare was again positive, male energy. The next flare to come is named Persephonia, and will give us the word perish. This new flare is negative or female energy. The fourth solar flare, Persephonia, is the cause of the vibrational disturbances felt at this time. Remember, please, that these are the names of flares, which are atmospheric disturbances. This flare will be stronger even than the third flare was, and will intermix again with the oversoul, and will cause much upheaval and death on planet Earth. But another meaning of Persephonia is personification of revival of nature in spring. Satania also went to planet number 1, Orion. Planet number 1 was arid and barren of growth. Perhaps I should say barren of nutrients. It was rock surface. By the time Satania, the third flare, got to planet number 2, Placida, there was more nourishment, more interaction with more compounds in the soil, more minerals to feed this thought form. This planet was not as barren as planet number 1. There was no soil. There was just the beginning of sand crumbling off the rock surface. There was more on planet number 2 than there had been on planet number 1, certainly, but not an awful lot more. The group that started wondering if there was more to life than this started spreading the dissatisfaction, the unrest to the others. The little storms started growing more agitated. Fights broke out, and they knew they just couldn't stay there. They knew that planet number 2 could not contain them. They had grown. They just had to break out of the walls of planet number 2. There just had to be something more. What an existence this was. Just floating around there all day long, arguing with this guy and arguing with that one. They couldn't even punch each other out because they were just thought forms. There was a lot of mental debate going on, a lot of arguing back and forth about things. The energy that forms into groups on planet number 2 tends to stay together through the whole trip. Eventually, the groups got tired of playing around this way. Even though it is pleasant, it begins to seem quite useless. When this thought strikes this particular ringlet of energy, it leaves the atmosphere of planet number 2 and proceeds to planet number 3. The storms grew bigger and bigger, and they finally just left planet number 2, whoosh, in one huge cloud of energy. It was not in the form of fire or anything like that. It was still just like a cloud, only a big rolling, tumbling, turmoiling cloud. And it went to planet number 3, which was Mars. The cloud was still in a gaseous form, but soon developed into a thinking bolt of lightning, an electrical line of energy. As this one-cell amoeba split, the ones that did not split had the double stomach intestinal tract, totally different from the ones who did split. Keep in mind that the ones that did split were forming into a very different kind of animal, one that started standing up on its hind legs, one that had a different internal makeup, the caveman stage. This came approximately 20 million years ago. The biological kingdom actually developed with the evolution of sound, beginning with the forming of the first ear canal. This was in aquatic life and is now in the form of gills. Reptile stage. The next stage was the tube's elongation into the throat cavity. This took place in reptiles and triggered an automatic response of the whiplash movement of the fang. Hooved animals. This developed into a larger opening as far as the outer manifestation, and the inner ear became separated from the throat cavity with what is now an eardrum. Heavy-furred animals. The next stage was that of a split canal, the inner and the outer canals for the ear. This took place in heavy-furred animals. Early man. The next stage then was one of tuning that caused the growth of tiny sound interpreters to develop. These animal men had need of sharper hearing abilities for protection. The ear has always been used for protection. Even now, that is one of its biggest tasks. Genetic experimentation. The next stage, then, was the refinement of this total ear that was caused by the insemination experiments on the animals that had begun standing up. By insemination of genes from higher planets, the ear canal took on the form it has now. These canals into the head are very important to the communication between dimensions. This is a stage that appeared here. This first stage of interpretation of messages was the separation point between the animal and the human kingdoms. This was a forerunner to speech. This stage had to come before speech could. Speech itself, of course, came next. The next stage will be the ear chakra. The refinement of the outer looks of the ears continued. The ears are pointed on many planets to help with an antenna effect, as this is what they must be considered, antenna. This is the next kingdom, and the stage where humanity is at the present. The ears are the antenna between the inner dimensions and the higher dimensions. They are very important to the development and growth of humans spiritually. On the second trip, the Andromedans discovered that the amoeba had progressed into the upright animal form. This ended the participation of the Andromedans, who came from all the inhabited planets in that galaxy, taking turns sending expeditions. These would be the first 2 days, biblically speaking. Having discovered the beautiful shaping up of this amoeba, the Andromedans turned to watch over to the Pleiades galaxy, which was responsible for the 3rd and 4th days, biblically speaking. The visitors from Andromeda and Pleiades were impressed with the perfection of the one-cell life they found on Earth. If this one-cell life had not been as perfect as it was, they would have given up on Earth and left the amoeba to progress into animal forms on its own. They had done this on previous planets, and this is where pictures of monsters came from. There are some planets with this form of life that other civilizations took on as colonies and inseminated with their genes, so the life on these planets may be highly intelligent and evolved, but may, to human eyes, be frightening to look upon. These planets are now capable of sending expeditions to Earth and others in our galaxy. They are merely curious and have no desire to harm humans. One must remember that humans look just as odd to them, probably even ugly. The forms on those planets were infused with genes at a much later stage of evolution than the inseminations that were done on Earth, and the physical forms had already evolved to a stage where they would look like what they do. Even though evolution on these planets is still going on, it is going in a different direction. These planets are outside of Earth's evolutionary chain, and humans will not take on these forms ever. But they should know that they exist and not be afraid to communicate with them. They are more highly evolved spiritually than us. Meanwhile, when the cloud of energy left planet number 2, Michael thought things would calm down on planet number 3, Mars, that it would be a nice, peaceful place to be, and they could just go on with their concepts of what a perfect life would be. Regardless, planet number 3 was causing much more friction than had been anticipated. This third solar flare from Lucifer, Satania, caused much more intermixing because it was a much stronger flare than the first two. Eventually, it came to rest on a planet of its own, Satania, which is the capital world of our galaxy. It is the capital ruling world of our solar system, and we actually know nothing of it. This capital world of Satania is on the other side of the sun. It is a world constantly blocked from the view of those of us on Earth. Because of the anger and frustration this flare picked up on the planets as it passed through them, this flare got the reputation of evil. There was something about it that just irritated every one of those groups of thought forms. The storms never did abate. They grew into massive storms and broke apart and formed numerous other storms, which just kept growing and growing and growing. The friction became so tremendous between these thought forms, these opposite factions of subatomic particles, that they finally started sending lightning bolts shooting off from themselves. This friction is a spark of life. It is a spark of life that is going to cause people to grow. If there is no friction, there is no growth. There can be no growth without a catalyst. Planet number 3 was not what he expected. There was more anger, frustration, fighting, and arguing. What he didn't expect was that conditions on this third little world would be such as to cause these little groups of atoms, these little puffs of his breath, to become angry and form into violent storms, with his breath becoming howling, raging wind, and terrible flashes of lightning, which was his own energy being torn from him. He realized he had created a monster. He hurriedly helped build the fourth world so he could aim these lightning bolts at it to give a release valve for the pressure buildup on the third little world. Michael watched fascinated as some of the strangest-looking creatures began to develop on this fourth world, planet Earth. They were fascinating, and he watched as they grew larger and took many different forms and shapes. He wanted so badly to join them, to go down there and play with them. Pleiades, third tripper day. At this time, the insemination experiments were begun that would carry the evolution on the planet ever forward. When the spacemen first landed, on the biblical third day, to do the first explorations, this is when they set their ship down. It was a huge mothership brought on this excursion for the purpose of a long-term stay for the astronauts to live in. The animals who saw them were frightened of this huge monster and all left the area. They finally tempted a few with food to come near them, ready to destroy them if they turned on them. These few were males. They needed to catch the females but could not contact them. They had to finally set traps. This was when the first genes, the pure strain, were injected into the race. Pleiades' fourth tripper day. By the time of the fourth trip, the animals had truly progressed past the ape stage into a different form. When the evolving animals were found to be standing upright, they were huge in size, what would be termed a giant in today's world. At the same time that they were inseminated with genes, they were also miniaturized to bring them down to the approximate size of the spacemen. The other animals were also large, but were not miniaturized at that time. Therefore, they continued to grow. But the ones who were of the ape family that had been inseminated continued to get smaller. The process took several generations. All these other animals continued developing along with the group of animals that had been miniaturized. This group was now standing up on their hind legs. They were beginning to group together, taking cover from the huge animals. These were the results of the split of the amoeba. They were more refined. They were to the point where they could think. They had this awareness, this instinct of self-preservation, honed to a sharper degree than the big animals of the animal kingdom. The more they began to separate themselves off into their groups, the greater the difference between them and the animals became. They gathered together to find food and for protection, and they began to form a group consciousness of taking care of each other. They also began banding together against the antagonism of the big animals. They were thinking on a certain level, to the point where they could plan ahead, perhaps to put food away for the hard winter weather. They had a realization of the cycles of nature. They seemed to understand what caused babies to be born. They had a rudimentary mind, working on an instinct level of procreation, self-preservation, and instinct survival. The Pleiadians carried it to the stage where the animals started walking upright, when it was possible to mate the animals with evolved life from other planets. Earth was then left alone for a lengthy period of time until the first animals started standing upright. The times when the big animals roamed the land was a period when Earth was left without help from other planets because of an event taking place at the other end of the Milky Way galaxy. A new star was being born, coming up out of a black hole like a bubble being blown out of a bubble pipe. It was a beautiful sight and an extremely exciting time period. This was the new planet spoken of in other material as almost being at the amoeba stage. This time period when there were no flights to Earth by spacemen was the time period when the Dark Ages were upon the land. When expeditions returned to Earth after this event was over, it was found to be overrun with huge animals, threatening extinction of this early man. These other animals had become so large they were a menace to all, and the ape men had to hide from them at all times. When the space flights resumed, it was realized that these huge animals had to be dealt with. They had to be destroyed as they also threatened the spacemen's safety. Many different means were tried, but the disintegration ray was the most effective. This left no large bodies to contaminate the Earth. At the same time, the species of these were miniaturized so the species would not be totally wiped out. Yes, this is possible today, and also it is possible to giantize any species, but why would the spacemen want to? As stated, some of the young were miniaturized and survive today in the mini state.